Imagine a country where basically 100% of the population is plugged into the electrical grid.
Right.
And like 91% of the people are actively scrolling the global internet.
Yeah.
You picture a highly modernized, incredibly connected society, right?
Yeah, you think so.
But now I want you to imagine that in that exact same country, over half of its young women are just completely sidelined from the economy. Like neither in school, nor working, nor getting any kind of professional training.
It's a massive contradiction.
It really is. Welcome to the great Moroccan development paradox.
It is arguably one of the most fascinating socioeconomic case studies of the 21st century.
Definitely.
Because you have this incredibly sleek, modern physical infrastructure, right?
Yeah.
Existing right alongside these deeply entrenched kind of 20th century social bottlenecks.
Yeah, and to figure out how a nation ends up with high-speed internet but massive youth unemployment, we are taking a deep dive into a very specific, custom-tailored source today.
It's a really unique document.
It is. We've been handed this 15-page, highly academic slide deck. It's basically a dense, empirical, macro-socioeconomic analysis of the Kingdom of Morocco.
Heavy on the data.
Oh, very heavy on the data. White backgrounds, flat graphics, pure numbers. And it tracks the country's development trajectory all the way from 1960 to 2024.
And the underlying data here is pulled from the heavy hitters. We're talking the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the UN.
Right.
We are looking at a massive trove of raw macroeconomic indicators: birth rates, container port traffic, water stress indices, carbon emissions. You name it, it's in this deck.
But, raw data on a white background is inherently cold.
Yeah, it doesn't tell you what it feels like.
Exactly. It doesn't tell you what it feels like to live through that kind of change. So our mission for this deep dive is to translate this mountain of empirical data into the actual human story.
Bring the numbers to life.
Right. We want to understand the mechanics of how a nation radically transforms itself over 6 decades. And to do that, we kind of have to start at the absolute foundation.
The macro view.
Yeah. Before we can talk about the fiber optic cables or the high-tech ports, we need to understand the fundamental shape of the population and the wealth of the nation.
Which requires traveling back to the 1960s.
Let's do it.
So the slide deck establishes a baseline for Morocco's modern era. And it begins by looking at gross national income, or GNI, per capita.
Okay.
In the 1960s, that figure was sitting at a mere $240.
Wait, let's just pause and hold on that number for a second. $240 a year.
A year.
Yes. That isn't just poor by modern standards. That is profound agrarian level subsistence.
It is.
We're talking about a reality where the overwhelming majority of a population is dedicating almost all of their daily energy just to acquiring enough calories to survive.
That is exactly the reality of a largely rural, post-colonial, traditional agricultural society.
Mm-hmm.
But the data tracks an extraordinary economic leap from that baseline.
How do they measure it?
The presentation calculates this using the Atlas method.
Oh, right, the Atlas method.
Just as a quick sidebar for anyone who isn't a data nerd, the Atlas method is essentially an economist's trick.
A very useful trick.
Very useful. It applies a specific conversion factor to smooth out the wild, short-term roller coaster of exchange rates and inflation.
So it stops the graph from looking like an EKG machine?
Exactly. It allows us to see the actual real-world trajectory of a country's wealth without being distracted by sudden currency spikes or crashes.
It filters out the noise so we can see the actual signal.
Correct. And the signal here is explosive growth. From that $240 baseline, the GNI per capita climbs steadily.
Just up and up.
It crosses the $1,000 mark in the late 70s. It hits $2,000 by the early 2000s.
Wow.
And recently it peaked at around $3,840.
That is a massive jump.
Furthermore, if you look at the adjusted net national income per capita, holding it in constant 2015 dollars to completely strip out the effects of inflation, it rises from roughly $995 to nearly $3,000.
So no matter how you slice the data, it's an immense accumulation of national wealth.
Undeniable wealth generation.
It's like a mountain of economic growth rising out of what was essentially a flat plain of subsistence farming. But, capital doesn't just magically generate itself.
No, it does not.
Something massive had to shift in the society to allow that wealth to pool up like that.
And the catalyst for that economic mountain was a profound demographic earthquake.
The ticking clock.
Yeah. This is where the story gets into the actual biology and structure of the Moroccan family.
Okay, lay it on me.
In 1960, the crude birth rate in Morocco was staggering. It was 50.1 births per 1,000 people.
50 per thousand. So we're talking about massive families.
Massive.
Like 7, 8, 9 children per household being the absolute norm.
The population pyramid was incredibly wide at the base.
Yeah.
You had an enormous number of children and a relatively small number of adults to support them.
Right.
But over the following decades, that birth rate absolutely plunges. It drops from 50.1 down to just 16.7 recently.
Wait, how does this society just stop having babies that quickly?
It's a radical shift.
Going from 50 down to under 17 in just a few generations? That changes the entire fabric of reality. It changes the size of a household, the physical layout of a city.
The role of women in society.
Exactly. What drives a crash like that?
It's driven by a combination of things. Urbanization, the rising cost of living in cities, and eventually the integration of women into broader educational systems.
Which makes sense.
Because when you live on a subsistence farm, a child is a vital economic asset.
They can work the fields, they can help with the harvest.
Exactly. But when you move to an apartment in Casablanca, a child becomes a massive economic liability.
Oh, yeah. They require space, tuition, food that you now have to buy instead of grow.
So the birth rate collapses. But the deck points out a secondary concurrent trend here.
What's that?
While the birth rate is crashing, the old age dependency ratio, which is the percentage of elderly people compared to the working age population, starts climbing.
So the population is getting older.
Yes, it goes from roughly 5.39% up to 11.36%.
Okay, so let me get this straight. The babies stop coming, and the older folks start living longer and making up a larger share of the population.
Precisely.
It sounds like the country is aging rapidly. I've heard economists use this phrase before, and I wonder if it applies here. Is Morocco caught in a race to get rich before it gets old?
That phrase perfectly encapsulates the underlying mechanism of what we call the demographic dividend.
The demographic dividend. Okay, let's unpack this for a second.
Let's break down how that mechanism actually works in practice, because it is the engine of Morocco's wealth accumulation.
Walk me through it.
Imagine a single household. The parents have 6 kids. All the parents' income goes toward feeding, clothing, and housing those dependent children.
So there is zero surplus money.
None. Nobody is saving for the future. They're just surviving.
Right, the ratio of consumers to producers in that house is totally out of balance. 2 people earning, 6 people consuming.
Exactly. Now, fast forward 20 years, those 6 kids grow up. They enter the workforce. Okay. But crucially, because of the cultural shifts we discussed, the move to the city, the cost of living, those 6 kids decide to only have 1 or 2 babies each.
Oh, see where this is going.
Suddenly, that extended family has a massive number of income-earning adults, but very few dependent children to feed.
And the original grandparents aren't quite old enough yet to need really expensive medical care.
Yes. So for a brief, magical window of time, the household is practically swimming in surplus cash.
They have a ton of workers and barely any dependents.
Exactly. Now apply that to an entire nation. When a country's birth rate drops rapidly, you get a temporary demographic window.
An army of working-age adults.
Generating surplus labor and surplus capital. And if the state manages the macroeconomy correctly during this window, which the GNI data proves Morocco largely did, you can accumulate national wealth at an astonishing rate.
You take that surplus capital and you use it to build highways.
Modernize ports.
Lay down infrastructure.
Exactly. But the catch is that the window doesn't stay open forever.
Because it's a relentlessly ticking clock.
It is. That massive generation of workers is going to age. And because they didn't have many children, the next generation of workers is going to be much smaller.
Right, so that rising old age dependency ratio we talked about hitting 11.36%, that's the early warning siren.
It proves that this golden demographic window is beginning to close. The era of easy demographics-driven growth is ending.
The country is entering the early stages of an aging society.
Yes.
You know, I'd ask you, the listener, to think about your own country's demographic shifts for a moment. We hear constantly about the aging populations in places like Japan, Italy, or South Korea.
The immense economic strain that puts on their systems.
Right. And seeing this exact same phenomenon play out in a North African context is fascinating. Morocco is essentially taking the demographic transition that took a century and a half in Western Europe and compressing it into a few decades.
They are playing the game of national development on fast forward.
Which leads us to the most critical question of their development strategy. While that demographic window was wide open and all that wealth was accumulating from $240 to nearly $4,000 per capita, Where did the state actually invest that capital?
Because they didn't just put it in a giant national savings account.
No, they physically altered the country. And this brings us to the second major theme of the slide deck, the physical and digital miracle.
Covering slides 6 and 7.
Yeah. And let me tell you, looking at the raw numbers, miracle is not hyperbole. Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's look at electricity access.
Okay.
Historically, national access to electricity was under 50%. In rural areas, it was shockingly low, hovering in the 13 to 20% range in the early years.
Basically, half the country and almost the entire rural periphery was living in the dark the moment the sun went down.
Exactly. But today, the data shows a staggering 100% national coverage.
Every single rural outpost, every village,
Yeah.
connected to the national grid.
Okay, I have to be the skeptic here for a second.
Go ahead.
100%. I mean, I've seen the geography of Morocco. I've seen photos of the high Atlas Mountains.
It's rugged.
Incredibly rugged. You have nomadic adjacent communities living in incredibly remote, hostile, mountainous terrain. You're telling me the state managed to string high-voltage power lines to absolutely everyone. How is that even logistically possible for a developing nation?
It requires a level of focused state capacity that is, frankly, rare.
It has to be.
The government executed what was called the Global Rural Electrification Program, and it was a monumental logistical feat.
I can't even imagine.
It wasn't just about laying neat copper wires along flat highways. It involved dragging utility poles up mountainsides using donkeys.
Using donkeys?
Yes.
Say.
It involved engineering microgrids for valleys that were just too remote to connect to the main artery. It took decades of relentless grinding physical labor. When we talk about escaping the infrastructure poverty trap, this is what it looks like in the mud and the dirt. They fundamentally conquered their own geography.
And they didn't stop at electricity either. The digital revolution followed the exact same explosive trajectory.
Which is slide 6 in the deck.
Right. In the late 90s and early 2000s, internet penetration was practically zero, less than 1%.
And today.
Today, it has rocketed to an incredible 91%.
That is a staggering leap.
So they closed the infrastructure gap, they laid the fiber optic cables, they built the cell towers, they strung the power lines. But I want to ask a philosophical question here.
Okay.
Turning the lights on for 100% of a population is a monumental feat. It's like flipping a switch on an entire era. But does laying down copper wire and erecting cell towers automatically equal human development?
The data provides a resounding yes.
Really?
And it proves it by drawing a direct, indisputable line between physical infrastructure and human biology.
Human biology, explain that.
This is where the statistics get incredibly poignant. Let's look at infant mortality from slide 7. In the 1960s, the male infant mortality rate was over 153 per 1,000 live births.
That means more than 15% of baby boys did not survive.
Yes.
That is a devastating, heavy reality for a society to bear.
But look at the recent data. That number plummeted from 153 down to a low of 19.6.
That's a massive drop, but how does stringing a power line up a mountain save a baby's life?
Well, yes, the country trained more doctors and built more clinics, but more fundamentally, they delivered electricity.
Okay, I'm tracking.
When a remote rural clinic finally gets reliable grid power, they can plug in a refrigerator.
Oh, wow. The cold chain.
The cold chain is everything in modern medicine.
Right, because you can't just leave medicine out in the heat.
Exactly. You cannot store vaccines at room temperature in the North African summer. You cannot store antibiotics. You cannot safely store blood for transfusions if a mother hemorrhages during a complicated childbirth.
It's life or death.
If a rural clinic relies on a diesel generator that breaks down or runs out of fuel, the cold chain breaks, the vaccines spoil, and people die.
So when you introduce a 100% reliable electrical grid, modern medicine can finally reach the physical periphery of the country.
Exactly. And the health improvements don't just happen at the clinic, they happen inside the homes.
How so?
The data shows that access to clean fuels and technologies for cooking rose to over 98%.
Oh, okay. Which is another massive, often overlooked public health victory.
Huge. Think about the daily reality before that infrastructure existed. If you don't have electricity or clean gas, how do you boil water? How do you cook bread?
You burn biomass.
Yes, you burn wood, animal dung, or charcoal inside an enclosed home.
The indoor air pollution generated by that has to be utterly devastating.
It is, particularly to the respiratory systems of women who do the cooking and the small children who are in the home with them.
It's basically the equivalent of forcing a toddler to smoke 2 packs of cigarettes a day just by making them sit in the kitchen while dinner is prepared.
It's a brutal reality. So when the grid arrives and clean cooking fuel arrives, the rates of chronic respiratory diseases absolutely plummet.
And we see the nutritional outcomes improving right alongside this. I mean, the data tracks child stunting, which is a tragic biological marker of chronic malnutrition in children under 5.
And that rate dropped.
It dropped to 14.9%. Severe wasting dropped to 1.1%.
So the basic fundamental biological security of the population was stabilized by this physical infrastructure miracle.
They successfully delivered on the physical hierarchy of needs: power, internet, vaccines, clean air in the kitchen.
Yes.
But I want you to think about the psychological shift that accompanies this. I've been thinking about this a lot while looking at the data.
The psychological impact of connectivity.
Exactly. Imagine a young person living in one of those rural villages in the Atlas Mountains. They now have reliable electricity, which is life-changing. But they are also part of that 91% connected to the global internet.
They're holding a smartphone.
Right. They are holding a portal to the entire planet. They are scrolling through TikTok, Instagram, or YouTube.
They are watching vlogs of people their exact same age living in Paris or New York or Dubai.
Exactly. They are absorbing global living standards in real time. But physically, they are still stepping outside their door into a developing economy.
That dynamic has to build massive, overwhelming societal expectation.
It really does. The baseline for what constitutes a good life is no longer what their grandparents had in 1960. The baseline is now globally comparative.
It creates a tremendous psychological pressure cooker.
Pressure cooker, I like that phrasing.
When a state solves the infrastructure problem and the internet connectivity problem, they inadvertently upgrade the aspirations of their entire youth population overnight.
The youth are physically located in Morocco, but their digital reality, their comparative baseline, is completely borderless.
And if the domestic economy cannot meet those hyperinflated, digitally driven expectations, you generate deep systemic frustration.
Which brings us to the tipping point of this deep dive.
Slide 8 and 9.
Yes, we need to talk about the education paradox, specifically the terrifying gap between access and quality.
Because that infrastructure miracle we just talked about, the roads, the power, the stabilized health, all of that paved the way for getting children out of the agricultural fields and into actual classrooms.
And at a structural level, the triumphs here are undeniable. The slide deck highlights a massive breakthrough in fundamental attendance.
Let's look at the early numbers.
In the early years, the percentage of primary school-aged children who were out of school was over 60%.
6 out of every 10 children simply did not go to school.
And the gender gap back then was a chasm. Girls were kept home for domestic labor or early marriage at vastly higher rates than boys.
But the modern data shows an incredible reversal.
It really does. That out-of-school rate dropped from over 60% to less than 1% today.
Which is an enormous logistical achievement.
Furthermore, the female lower secondary completion rates rose astonishingly fast, drastically narrowing the historical gap with male students.
They built the schools, they made it safe to travel to them, and the girls showed up.
Gender parity in basic attendance was largely achieved.
That sounds like an absolute victory.
It does, but then the slide deck introduces what has to be the most heartbreaking statistic in the entire presentation.
On slide 9.
Yeah. They define a metric called learning poverty. And the numbers here are jarring.
Brace yourself.
Despite near universal enrollment, despite the fact that less than 1% of kids are out of school, 66.9% of children finishing primary school cannot read at a minimum proficiency level.
Nearly 67%. Over 2/3 of the children sitting in those newly built classrooms are functionally illiterate at the end of primary school.
I am trying to wrap my head around this. Let me try an analogy to explain the mechanics of what's happening here.
Go for it.
It's like the government spent billions of dollars building a state-of-the-art smartphone factory. The building is flawless, the electricity is 100% reliable, the workers show up on time every single day, they assemble the glass and the microchips perfectly, but they completely forget to install the operating system.
Wow. Yeah.
We have a 99% success rate in physical attendance, but a nearly 67% failure rate in actual cognitive learning. The hardware of the education system is fully installed, but the software is entirely missing.
That analogy hits the nail on the head.
So what does this all mean?
Well, in development economics, we distinguish between quantitative expansion and qualitative transformation.
Okay, break that down.
The Moroccan system successfully executed the quantitative expansion. A state bureaucracy knows how to pour concrete. It knows how to build a cinder block classroom, assign a teacher to a district, and legally mandate that a child sit at a desk.
Because that is a logistical problem.
Exactly. And as we saw with the electrical grid up the mountains, the state is actually quite brilliant at logistics.
But building a mind isn't a logistical problem. You can't just mandate comprehension.
No, you cannot. Quality is elusive. Teaching a child to critically process written text, to understand math, to engage in analytical thinking that requires highly trained, highly motivated, and well-compensated educators.
Right.
It requires a curriculum that engages the student's curiosity, rather than just demanding endless rote memorization.
Why is rote memorization always the default in these rapidly expanding systems? I feel like I read about that everywhere.
Because it is cheap, and it's easy to standardize.
Ah,
When you are rushing to get millions of first-generation students into classrooms, you don't have time to train a generation of elite, critical thinking pedagogues.
you just need warm bodies at the front of the room.
Yeah. You hire whoever has a basic degree, give them a textbook, and tell them to make the kids repeat the sentences until they memorize them.
And the data supports this. It shows the primary pupil-teacher ratio remains stubbornly high, around 26 students per teacher.
So you have overcrowded classrooms dealing with outdated pedagogical methods. The children are physically present in the room, but cognitively absent.
Think about the difference between presence and engagement in your own life. You know, showing up to a mandatory corporate meeting or sitting in the back of a large lecture hall does not mean you are absorbing the material.
Not at all.
Quantity, the number of bodies in a room, is so easy to measure on a spreadsheet. Quality, the actual spark of understanding, is incredibly difficult to foster and measure.
And the downstream macroeconomic implications of this learning poverty are incredibly severe.
How bad does it get?
Well, we are operating in a knowledge-based 21st century global economy. A nation cannot innovate, it cannot transition to high-tech manufacturing, and it cannot compete globally using a workforce where 2/3 of the population lacks basic reading proficiency at age 10.
Because those kids don't stay 10 years old forever.
Right.
They eventually age out of that struggling primary education system. They become young adults and they have to enter the workforce to survive.
Which brings us to the economic engine of the country and the massive youth bottleneck that it has created.
Covering slides 5, 12, 13, and 14. So what exactly are these functionally struggling students walking into when they leave school?
They are walking into an economy that has undergone a massive, highly successful structural modernization, but one that is aggressively bifurcated.
Bifurcated,
Okay.
split into two pieces.
Yes, it is split into two entirely different worlds.
Yeah.
Let's look at the first world. Historically, agriculture's value added to the GDP was around 23.4%. Today, it has dropped and stabilized in the 10 to 15% range.
So the country is less reliant on farming, it diversified?
Highly diversified. Exports grew significantly. The crown jewel of this modernization is the logistics sector.
The ports.
Yes. The slide deck highlights container port traffic, specifically places like the Tanger Med megaport.
Which is huge.
It is massive. This port processes millions of PEUs annually. A TEO, for context, stands for a 20-foot equivalent unit. It's the standard, universal measure for a shipping cargo container.
Right, the big metal boxes.
Exactly. Morocco has successfully positioned itself as a highly integrated, automated regional logistics hub connecting African, European, and global trade routes.
Okay, I have to push back hard here.
Okay, let's hear it.
I am looking at the employment data in this deck, and it makes absolutely no sense when paired with what you just said.
How so?
We just established that the country has 100% electricity, 91% internet penetration, and booming, highly modernized global megaports processing millions of containers.
Yes, the macro engine is humming.
Then how does that reality coexist with youth unemployment sitting at a staggering 32.6%?
It's a stark contrast.
1 in 3 young people has no job, and it gets much worse. The NEET rate, which stands for Not in Education, Employment, or Training for Young Women, is an alarming 53.9%.
Over half.
Over half of the young women in this country are completely sidelined. They aren't in school, they don't have a job, and they aren't learning a trade. How is that statistically possible in a country with high-speed internet and automated global ports?
To understand that, you have to connect the dots back to the smartphone factory analogy we just discussed.
You're learning poverty.
Yes. The learning poverty directly fuels the youth unemployment crisis. The modernizing export sector, those massive automated ports, the aeronautics factories popping up, the automotive assembly plants, they don't need manual laborers to carry heavy bags anymore.
They don't need sheer muscle.
Exactly. They require high-skill labor. They need logistics, software managers, robotics technicians, coders, and highly literate engineers.
They need the software, not just the hardware.
Precisely. The modern formal economy is a high-speed bullet train. But the national education system is supplying a workforce where 67% lacked basic reading proficiency at the end of primary school.
So there is a massive structural skills mismatch.
Yes, the high-speed train is flying down the tracks, but the education system is leaving the youth standing on the platform without a ticket.
And when you don't have a ticket for the formal economy, you don't just disappear into thin air. You still have to eat. You still have to survive. Where do these millions of young people go?
They get absorbed into the shadow economy.
The massive informal sector.
Yes. You become a street vendor selling goods for cash. You become a day laborer on a construction site with no safety regulations. Or you work in a tiny, unregistered textile workshop hidden in an alleyway.
Just totally off the grid.
And the data confirms the colossal scale of this shadow economy. Between 47.7% and 55.3% of registered companies report competing against unregistered firms.
Let me process that.
Oh.
Over half of the legitimate tax-paying businesses in the country feel threatened by the shadow economy.
Yes.
That means the informal sector isn't just like a few people selling fruit on the corner. It is an industrial-scale parallel system operating entirely off the books.
It is an enormous parallel ecosystem, and operating in the shadows makes that population incredibly vulnerable.
How does the deck show that vulnerability?
It highlights this fragility through the lens of financial inclusion. Overall financial inclusion, meaning the percentage of people over 15 who actually have a bank account or a mobile money account, is only 44.3%.
Wait, less than half the country has a bank account? We established earlier that 91% of the population has the internet.
I know, it's wild.
You would think mobile banking apps would be absolutely ubiquitous by now. Just tap a button on your phone?
You would think so, but a bank account requires documentation. It requires proof of address and often a formal salary slip.
Oh, right.
If you exist entirely in the cash-based shadow economy, the formal banking sector doesn't want you. And there is a sharp, devastating gender divide here. 55.9% of men have accounts, compared to only 32.7% of women.
Which ties right back into that 53.9% NEET rate for young women.
Exactly.
If you aren't in school and you aren't working in the formal sector, you don't have a bank account. You are economically invisible to the state.
And being economically invisible makes you incredibly fragile when macroeconomic shocks hit the system.
What kind of shocks are we talking about?
Well, the slide deck points out that historical shocks in CPI, the Consumer Price Index, which measures inflation, have peaked at 17.5% in the past.
Okay, so massive inflation spikes. But why does a 17.5% inflation spike matter so much more to an informal worker? Doesn't inflation hurt everyone?
It does, but think about the mechanics of inflation. If you work in the formal economy, maybe you have some savings in a bank that yields a little interest to offset the inflation.
Right.
Or, more importantly, maybe your labor union negotiates a cost of living wage increase with your corporate employer. You have shock absorbers.
You have leverage.
Exactly. But if you are an unbanked young woman working in an unregistered workshop, dealing entirely in day-to-day cash,
A 17.5% inflation spike doesn't just hurt, it crushes you.
it destroys your purchasing power instantly.
Your cash under the mattress is suddenly worth 17% less. Your daily wage buys 17% less food, and you have zero institutional leverage to ask for a raise. You have no financial safety net whatsoever.
The precariousness of that daily existence is staggering.
And it is a precariousness born directly from the state's failure to translate their massive infrastructure gains into human capital gains.
Yeah, that's exactly right. But as if a systemic youth employment crisis wasn't a large enough hurdle, the slide deck reveals an existential physical limit threatening this entire economic engine.
It's not a lack of financial capital or a lack of internet bandwidth.
Right.
It is a lack of water.
Slides 10 and 11.
We have to talk about the climate crisis because in this context, it is the great multiplier of every other socioeconomic problem we've discussed.
It makes everything worse.
Let's look at the raw water data. We established earlier that agriculture has modernized and shrunk, now only making up 10 to 15% of the national GDP.
Right.
Yet the data shows that agriculture still consumes an overwhelming 77.7% of the nation's total freshwater withdrawals.
It's a massive disproportion.
Meanwhile, the overall water stress index for the country has climbed into the high-risk zone of 50 to 71%.
And just to clarify, a water stress index of 50 to 71% means the country is drawing down its available fresh water, pumping from underground aquifers, draining reservoirs drastically faster than nature can replenish it with rainfall.
It is an unsustainable ecological deficit.
Highly unsustainable.
I have to use an analogy here because the imbalance is wild. It's like having a bad roommate who only pays 10% of the monthly rent, but insists on drinking 77% of the expensive bottled water in the house, takes 2-hour showers every day, and leaves the kitchen tap running just for fun.
That's a painfully accurate analogy.
Why is an industry that contributes relatively little to the GDP allowed to consume almost all the water in a highly water-stressed region? It seems completely economically irrational to let farms drink all the water while the high-tech cities run dry.
If you are looking at a pure, sterile GDP spreadsheet, it is irrational. But politically and socially, it is deeply, profoundly complex.
Tell me why.
Agriculture may be a smaller slice of the macroeconomic pie, but it still employs a massive chunk of the population, especially the rural poor.
Ah, I see. It's a social safety net disguised as an economic sector.
Exactly. The government can't just turn off the water to the farms because those farms employ millions of people who have nowhere else to go.
Right, you'd trigger a famine or a mass uprising.
But here is the fatal structural vulnerability. Morocco's agriculture is highly dependent on rainfall, not advanced irrigation.
Okay.
So when a drought hits and climate changes, making droughts significantly more frequent, longer, and more severe across North Africa, it doesn't just lower the national GDP by a few percentage points.
It destroys millions of rural livelihoods overnight.
Yes.
The crops fail. The rural farmer has zero income for the year.
And what does that farmer, or more likely the teenage children of that farmer, do when the land dries up and there is no food?
They don't just sit there.
No, they leave. The climate crisis creates a massive, undeniable push factor. They migrate away from the rural villages, the very villages that just got electricity a decade ago, and they move into the sprawling, crowded urban centers like Casablanca, Tangier, or Marrakech, desperately looking for work.
Okay, the loop is closing. I see how all these data points connect now.
It all comes together.
They arrive in the city looking for a job. But remember the education data. They are carrying the heavy burden of that 66.9% learning poverty.
Yep.
They grew up in a rural school that failed them. They don't have the coding skills or the literacy for the high-tech Tanger Med port jobs.
Exactly. So where do they go?
They get dumped straight into the massive, shadowy, informal economy.
That is the tragic interconnectivity of macroeconomics. You cannot isolate a physical water shortage from a labor market shortage.
Because they feed into each other.
A lack of rain in the mountains directly inflates the informal economy in the city, which directly spikes the youth NEET rate, which drives up poverty. It all feeds back into a single vicious cycle.
And the state is clearly aware that they have to modernize their environmental approach before the system completely breaks. The data tracks energy and emissions alongside the water crisis.
Right. On slide 10.
Per capita CO2 emissions rose from 0.45 tons to roughly 1.3 tons. The deck explicitly notes this excludes LULUCF.
LULUCF is an acronym for land use change, and forestry. Essentially, it means we are stripping out the carbon effects of planting new forests or cutting down trees so we can look exclusively at the raw industrial carbon footprint of the nation.
And it makes sense that the industrial footprint tripled. I mean, you build a national electrical grid, you build massive concrete megaports, you pick thousands of miles of roads, your carbon emissions are going to skyrocket.
Industrialization is inherently carbon heavy.
It is. But the data shows Morocco is aggressively fighting back against that carbon curve.
They really are.
Non-hydro renewable energy, we're talking massive, glittering solar farms in the desert, and huge wind turbine projects along the coast jumped from practically 0% to an impressive 16.4% of total electricity generation.
They're desperately trying to decouple their economic growth from carbon emissions.
Which is commendable.
They're building the infrastructure of the future. But the water scarcity remains the ultimate Achilles heel. You can engineer and manufacture a solar panel. You cannot manufacture rain.
Which brings us to the final verdict of this massive slide deck, slide 15, the conclusion.
We need to pull all these diverse, conflicting threads together.
What is the final tally at the end of this 60-year transformation from a poor agrarian society to a deeply complex, bifurcated modern state?
The conclusion is a story of incredible, historic physical triumphs overshadowed by daunting, unresolved human challenges.
Let's start with the triumphs.
The achievements are undeniable, and they should be celebrated. Morocco successfully escaped the infrastructural poverty trap.
100% electricity.
They achieved near-total digital and electrical coverage. They conquered their geography. They achieved gender parity in basic educational access. They built the physical foundations of a highly capable modern state.
But the structural challenges remain incredibly heavy.
Very heavy.
Human capital quality is severely lagging, resulting in that devastating learning poverty. The failure of labor market integration is leaving 32.6% of the youth and 53.9% of young women trapped in the informal sector.
Completely unbanked and vulnerable.
And hanging over all of it is a severe existential water crisis.
Which defines the policy outlook for the next decade. The path forward for the Moroccan economy depends entirely on three pillars.
Okay, what are they?
First, a substantive, qualitative upgrade in education they have to install the software in the minds of the youth.
Right.
Second, deeper integration of those youth into the formal global value chains. And third, urgent climate resilience, specifically regarding advanced water management.
You know, if we synthesize this entire deep dive, what strikes me is how deeply interconnected those three pillars are. Solving the physical water crisis and solving the cognitive education crisis are not two different projects.
They're the exact same project.
Because how do you solve a 21st century water crisis in a drought-prone region? You don't do it by looking up at the sky and praying for rain.
No, you do it by building advanced, energy-efficient desalination plants. You do it by coding precision drip irrigation algorithms that optimize every single drop of water.
You do it by bioengineering drought-resistant crops.
And you cannot invent, build, manage, or repair any of those advanced climate technologies if 67% of your workforce cannot read at a proficient level.
Exactly. You need a highly skilled, adaptable, and scientifically literate society to engineer your way out of climate change. The cognitive software of the population has to catch up to the physical hardware of the state.
The human capital is the climate resilience strategy.
It is the only strategy that works in the long run. The physical infrastructure can only take a nation so far.
So true.
Which leaves you with a final, provocative thought to mull over. When we look at all this data, all these trend lines tracking wealth, concrete, and fiber optics, we are really looking at the illusion of control.
How do you mean?
We see a nation that successfully solved its visible physical problems. They conquered the dark by turning on the lights. They conquered the isolation by paving the roads and laying the cell towers. They got the kids out of the fields and physically placed them inside a school building.
They mastered the logistics of the visible world.
But in solving all those highly visible problems, did they inadvertently expose the much harder, completely invisible problems?
The invisible problems.
Yes. Because the ultimate truth hidden in this data is that it is far easier to run thousands of miles of high-voltage cable across a harsh desert mountain range to build a national power grid than it is to fundamentally change how a single human mind learns inside a classroom.
It is easier to build a robotic, automated megaport than it is to control how the rain falls.
We started this deep dive asking how a country could be 100% plugged into the modern world, yet leave half its young women disconnected from the economy. The answer is that the wires are easy, the people are incredibly hard. We have mastered the art of measuring the things we can see, but the true test of any nation's future is how it measures and how it nurtures the things we cannot.